Hello, dear students, and welcome to another session on appreciating poetry. We shall continue with In Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Auden. We are to do the second and the third section of the poem. So let's begin. Now, the second and the third section of the poem. The second section of the poem is only one stanza long, and the second section is an intensely personal and very compassionate address to the dead poet. You can say from the first section uh, is where Auden uses the third person. He was till now addressing Yeats in the third person, that is he disappeared in the dead of night. It was all about he, so it was in the third person singular. The narration was in the third person. But in the second section, when you get to the second section, you find that the narration changes from the third person to the second person, you. Okay, it becomes more intense, it becomes more personal. Okay, it's all about the man who suffered, and that it was this suffering of that particular poet, or the sufferings of Yeats, that created the poet in him. Your gift survived it all. It outlasted your physical it outlasted your physical decay. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. So it's all about your. So from the third person, it moves on to the second. In the second section, it moves on to the second person narration. So Auden begins by telling us that Yeats was just like any of us, silly or emotional or very sensitive. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. So just like you and me, he was also an ordinary person, silly and emotional and very sensitive. He survived all these problems, and it was his poetry. Your gift here is a reference to poetry. It is Yeats's poetry that helped him to survive all these problems, all his sensitiveness, all his emotional problems, all that. He was able to overcome all this because of his gift, because of his poetry. That is, this gift, that is poetry, enabled him to survive his weaknesses like love for beautiful women, his sensitive reaction to common and political failings, all that. Now, when I speak about beautiful women, Yeats was in love with had close connection with several beautiful women, and he was also criticized for that. Of course, these personal relations were mostly intellectual. Some, of course, especially his love for Maud Gonne, was very personal. He loved her, he approached her, but she rejected his love. So he approached her when her marriage with her husband failed. He approached her, and again he was let down. She rejected him. And after her death, in fact, it is even said so that Yeats had approached her daughter, Maud Gonne's daughter, because അമ്മയെ കിട്ടിയില്ല, അപ്പം മകളെങ്കിലും ഇരിക്കട്ടെ എന്ന് വിചാരിച്ചിട്ട് മകളെയും പ്രപ്പോസ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. അങ്ങനത്തെ കുറേ മണ്ടത്തരങ്ങളൊക്കെ യേറ്റ്സ് കാണിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. He was very sensitive, and also he had several weaknesses like several other or like ordinary people. So that is what is being stated in the second stanza. Second stanza, it's more about personal things, or it's not about his poetry as such. It is about his personal failings, his personal weaknesses. association with Irish national movement, his unrest in all the things which he felt is not logical or right, all that he reacted through his poetry. And it was all these weaknesses, personal failures of the poet is all forgotten because his poetry was enough to survive all these weaknesses. ഇപ്പോൾ മിക്കപ്പോഴും നമ്മളുടെ തന്നെ ഒരുപാട് ജയനെ പറ്റിയിട്ട് നമ്മുടെ സിനിമാ നടൻ ജയൻ, ആൾക്കൊരുപാട് പേഴ്സണൽ വീക്ക്നെസ്സസ് ഉണ്ടായിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു ആളുടെ ലൈഫിലായാലും. ദർ were several controversies in his life, but we all, or the Malayalam film industry even today, this very day, love him and consider him a very important person, a very important actor. Now, why was Jayan able to survive his weaknesses, his controversy? His personal life had a lot of controversies, but all those controversies are forgotten, and only the actor Jayan is remembered. Just like that, here also Auden says that Yeats had a lot of personal problems, personal controversies. He was a very emotional person, very sensitive person. He was a very impulsive person. But all these weaknesses were forgotten by the people because his poetry was able to surpass or survive these weaknesses. Okay, the parish of rich women, physical decay. Now, the parish of rich women, this is a reference to his personal life. As I told you earlier, his involvement with aristocratic women like Lady Gregory. He was very much associated with Lady Gregory. Now, Lady Gregory is a very important person in association with the Celtic revival. You will study all that very soon in your semesters, next few semesters. You will be studying all that. You will study more about Yeats as such, the Irish rebellion, and also the Celtic revival and all. So he had a close association with Lady Gregory. Maud Gonne, as I told you, he fondly, or he loved Maud Gonne. But Maud Gonne rejected him twice. In fact, she never wanted to marry him at all. And he had even approached Maud Gonne's daughter. After the death of Maud Gonne, he had even approached Maud Gonne's daughter, but even she rejected Yeats, and it was then he decided to get married. And also his association with Olivia Shakespeare. All these people were aristocratic women, and he had close association with these people. These ladies, they admired and encouraged and inspired him, but none of his involvement means his involvement with these rich aristocratic women has affected his poetic genius. It may have affected his personal life, okay, but it has not brought any black mark on his poetic genius. He surpassed all this. Okay, he surpassed all of these personal weaknesses. Now, physical decay. Now, what do you mean by physical decay? Physical decay again is a reference to the old age and the consequent decline in one's growth, both physically as well as mentally. Old age was also a theme of Yeats' later poem. Yeats അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പോയത്തിൽ തന്നെ later poems, it was mostly about old age. So Auden brings that theme also. Now, Auden says that Yeats' poetry, his artistic talents, has enabled him to surpass even the old age. He was able to overcome the old age. He was able to overcome all the physical problems that old age brought out. All the subsequent decline of poetic faculty. See, when you grow old, your thinking capacity also comes down, declines. Your ability to think, your ability to creative quality also comes down, but it has not affected Yeats. That's what Auden says. Yeats' poems has surpassed all that, and his poems were never affected by his bad health. Yourself. Now look at the word yourself. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Yourself here is a reference to the personal idiosyncrasies and weaknesses of human being. All his personal weaknesses. So he was able to surpass everything. He was able to surpass all those personal criticisms that he encountered. He was able to surpass his old age. He was able to surpass all those problems, decline in both physical as well as mental growth that is brought out by old age. He was able to surpass all his emotional, very sensitive problems, all the unrest he had, all that he was able to surpass because of his gift, and that gift was poetry. His poetry was able to surpass all these problems. Okay? Your poetry or poetic genius is immortal. That's what he says. Your poetry or poetic genius is immortal, and it is the one that gave you the ability to surpass all the human ordinary frailties of life. So that's 3 lines would mean this. You were silly like us, your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself, all that would mean that you were able to surpass all these human, ordinary weaknesses of life that everybody faces because of your poetic genius. And your poetic genius is immortal. All the ups and downs of life, all the bittersweet experiences, all the physical problems, you could survive them only because your poetry was strong. Your poetry was immortal. I hope you understood. Now next line, look at the next line. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still. Now here, I want you to bear a few things in mind. See, in the second section, there is poetry is powerful. Auden says that poetry is powerful, but he challenges the conventional way of dealing with poetry. Auden does not believe that poetry is an everything in itself. Auden says that poetry is powerful. It can change things. But it does not mean that it will be able to, or it has the ability to change the whole world. It can only change the world through the perspective of the writer or the poet, the tone of the writer or the poet. It can only touch the soul and not the world. The world will go on as it is. You cannot change the world. Gandhiji spoke about ahimsa. Gandhiji gave us a true example. Gandhiji helped us gain freedom. But do you think the Indians are still following Gandhiji's footsteps? Was Gandhiji able to completely move everyone, each and every single people or citizen of the world? No. So it touches upon people, their soul, and only those who are open to it will benefit out of it. The world is not going to completely change. That is why I want you to connect this with the first stanza also. Wolves running through the evergreen forest, the peasant river as it is. That is, nature is not going to stop. As in pastoral elegies, what happens is the poet says that even the nature mourns, the nature stops. So here, by using or breaking those conventional pastoral elegy, the poet Auden tries to tell us that nothing is going to change. Don't expect that poetry is going to change the whole world. The whole nature is not, the nature or the course of life cannot be changed. It will go on its own course. It can affect so many people, but only those who are open to it. We'll come to that soon. So in this second stanza, he's also challenging, in a way, the power of poetry. Okay, it's a different philosophy. All right. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. This can be seen as a beautiful expression of the genesis of poetry in a poet's heart. All the hurts and sufferings that Yeats went through, എല്ലാ വിഷമങ്ങളും സങ്കടങ്ങളും യേറ്റ്സ് അനുഭവിച്ച ഓരോ പ്രശ്നങ്ങളും, ആ പ്രശ്നങ്ങളാണ് യേറ്റ്സ് എന്നുള്ള ഒരു കവിയെ ഉണ്ടാക്കിയിട്ടുള്ളത്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു കവിയെ പണിതെടുത്തിട്ടുള്ളത്. The problems that Yeats went through brought a sea change in the poet's mind, and this led to him composing beautiful poetry. Now, this reminds us of P.B. Shelley's words. Shelley ഇതിനെ പറ്റിയിട്ട് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്, പോയട്രീനെ പറ്റിയിട്ട്. ഷെല്ലിയുടെ പോയംസ് എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഇത്രയും പവർഫുൾ ആയിട്ടുള്ളത്, ഷെല്ലിയുടെ പോയംസ് ഇത്രയും ഭംഗിയായിട്ടുള്ളത് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പവർഫുൾ ആയിട്ടുള്ളത് എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണെന്ന് വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഷെല്ലി തന്നെ പറയുന്നുണ്ട്, I have suffered what I wrote, like a pearl that grows because of the irritants that get into the mother of pearl. The problems and sufferings that affect a poet's heart often provoke the poetry in him or are transmuted into poetry. ഷെല്ലി പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുള്ള വാക്കുകളാണ്. അതായത് ഷെല്ലി അനുഭവിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളതാണ് ഷെല്ലി എഴുതിയിട്ടുള്ളത്. ഒരു ഓയിസ്റ്റേഴ്സ് നിങ്ങൾ കണ്ടിട്ടുണ്ടാവും അല്ലേ, മുത്ത് എങ്ങനെ ഉണ്ടാവുന്നത്, ഓയിസ്റ്ററിനകത്താണ് മുത്തുണ്ടാവുന്നത്. ഈ മുത്തെന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ആക്ച്വലി ഇറ്റ് ഇസ് സംതിങ് ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് ഇറിറ്റൻ്റ് ആണ്. അതിൻ്റെ ഉള്ളിൽ വന്നിരിക്കുന്ന ഒരു തരം ഡസ്റ്റ് ഓർ ഡേർട്ടാണ്. അതവിടെ ഇരുന്നിരുന്ന് അതിൻ്റെ മുകളിലൊരു കോട്ടിങ് ഉണ്ടായിട്ട് അതൊരു മുത്തായിട്ട് മാറുന്നത്. ആൻഡ് ദീസ് ഇറിറ്റൻസ് ആർ ആക്ച്വലി പ്രോബ്ലംസ്. ഇറ്റ് ക്രിയേറ്റ്സ് പ്രോബ്ലംസ് ടു ദി ഓയിസ്റ്റർ. It is not good for the oyster. It creates problems. They are irritants. But what happens is eventually you get a pearl. So just like that, these sufferings and problems are like irritants in an oyster. And these irritants, they provoke the poet and makes him write beautiful poems. They are transmuted into poetry. Just like that, you can see the similar thing. Auden says that the same thing that happened to Yeats also. I had told you, right, Yeats was fighting for Irish freedom. Not very active participant, but he fought for Irish Republic or Irish freedom, nationalism. Through his poems, through his speech, he influenced, he urged that Ireland be given freedom. Yeats had devoted himself to the cause of Irish nationalism, and the weaknesses, the follies, and also the excellences of which these are the problems that he had faced are the ones that in fact motivated him to write poems. For example, one example would be, but then they have changed since the syllabus is revised, that poem is removed. I presume that is removed from your course of study. Last year we had that for the third semester students. They studied Easter 1916. It's a beautiful poem. I would really want you to go through that poem. You have to go through that poem, Easter 1916. This is based on the Irish uprising that led to a bloody revolution which was suppressed by England. Now, England was ruling Ireland. Of course, Ireland was under the control of England, and this uprising was both needed, at the same time not needed also. It was essential, but again it was inessential also, because there is a history to it. It was the World Wars. It was during the World Wars that this uprising happened. 1916, the First World War. The World War was going on, and England had promised Ireland that they would be given freedom soon after the war. War കഴിഞ്ഞതിന് ശേഷം അയർലൻഡിന് ഫ്രീഡം കിട്ടും എന്നുള്ളത് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ കൊടുക്കാം എന്നുള്ളത് അവർ പ്രോമിസ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ബട്ട് ദ ഐറിഷ് rebels or the revolutionaries were apprehensive of it. Many of them felt that England would not keep the word, and therefore what they did, they rose in revolt. It was on Easter Day, Easter Sunday, I don't know, 1916 Easter Sunday, and they rose in revolt, and it was suppressed. The revolt was a failure. Ireland did not get any freedom, and it was suppressed by the English. And it was in fact a bloody revolution with lots of bloodshed. People lost their lives, and it was unnecessary. So here in the poem Easter 1916, he praises and also criticizes this uprising, both praising because of course that feel of nationalism. He says, okay, I love that feel of nationalism in you. I feel happy and proud that you are rising in revolt. But again he asks, was this an essential one? Was it really needed? Each time in the poem Easter 1916, there's a refrain: all changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. Each line repeats that, each line you have the repetition of this refrain, a terrible beauty is born. See, look at the word terrible beauty. It's not beauty, it's a terrible beauty. So beauty is terrifying. So here through that word he's asking, was it really essential? It is beautiful. The uprising is needed, but it was a terrible one. A terrible beauty is born. Okay, that's why Yeats is considered to be a great poet. His epigrammatic style, and Auden also follows somewhat similar to that. Okay, and Auden continues to say that all that Yeats and even others had done for Ireland, that Yeats and others have done for Ireland, Ireland has forgotten. Ireland is still the same. It is mad Ireland. That's what he says. The people, they are still the same. They still have their madness, their unpredictability. They are unpredictable. Just like that geographical setting of Ireland, the people of Ireland are also unpredictable. They are impulsive. They are unpredictable. Okay, so he says, mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. The reason why you started writing poetry. Now it survives in the valley of its making, which means this valley of its making is the valley of poetry, which means that landscape or terrain of poetry is an intrapersonal one. It is different. Poetry is unaffected by everything. The poetry flows. Now if you read that stanza, it's a little complicated, but just read that stanza and you will understand. In the valley of its making, where it survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy grieves. Row towns that we believe and die in, it survives a way of happening, a mouth. It's about poetry. Poetry flows from the poet's isolation and grief. It flows from the poet's isolation and grief. A sensitive soul yearns for the betterment of the society, just like Yeats wanted. Yeats was always a sensitive person, so he always wanted betterment of the society. His poems are all about it. And he cries out in grief. But again, he is cut off from the real world. In the world of poetry is different from the real world. The real world, the terrain of the real world, the way of the real world is totally different from the terrain or the landscape of poetry, imagination. Because a poet, he remains in isolation. The poet believes in his ideal world which he created, and he believes that it has a big power, his imagination. He feels that this world that he has created, this terrain or this world of poetry, that is imagination, that he created, he feels that it has great power. He feels that it is the reality. It cannot affect it. He feels that he is able to change the society. That world that he has created is so powerful that it is able to change the society. But the reality is that the poet, he lives in that world and he dies in that world. The busy world, that is the real world, has very little patience to deal with these sort of imagination. They are uninterested. The busy world of the reality is uninterested to listen to all these imaginary things, philosophies and so on. But a poet believes that his philosophies has the ability to change the world. But that is just a myth. So by calling Ireland mad, Auden suggests that Yeats became a poet because of his urge to serve his country and to bring out a revival of both art and literature. But the wrongs of Ireland, all the thing that Ireland did, caused him pain and it hurt him. This turned him into a great poet. But again, Auden suggests from the very beginning, the bulls run, the Pessin River flows. There is no improvement made. The Irish people remain the same. There is no change in them. Yeats' poem could bring no improvement in the lot of the Irish people. That is what is meant by in the valley of its makings. It survives in the valley of its makings where executives would never want to tamper. Executives, the people, the real world, they would never want to tamper. They can never enter into that terrain. They can never tamper that philosophy. It flows on south in all corners of the mind. In all corners of the people, it arouses in the people, the imagination of people. It flows through every nook and corner of the soul, like a river. Okay, but that's not going to change reality. A poet feels that it can change. This is an indirect and a very disappointed remark from a disappointed poet. Poetry can make nothing happen. It is out of disappointment that Auden is saying this. It cannot change the course of human world, the outside world, because Yeats, what all he did for Ireland, and what is Ireland doing to him now? There is no change in the people of Ireland, in the way they behave, in their attitude towards life. There is no change at all. It still remains the same. Yeats wanted to bring a sea change in these Irish people. He wanted them to live peacefully. He wanted them to live holistically and harmoniously, but nothing happened. He thought that his poems could change the way the world moved. The corrupted world would go on as it is. Poetry here is compared to a river which can fertilize only the soul. It has no effect on the outside body. Okay? So, in short, what Auden tries to tell us is that nothing changed as Yeats had expected. Yeats thought that his poems would bring changes in the minds of the people. He thought that he could inspire and a more spiritual, more peaceful, more holistic way of life in the minds of the Irish people. But it did not happen. Ireland is still that crazy, mad place as it used to be. Auden also states that poetry is powerful, but it is not supposed to be something wielded for change. Don't think that poetry can bring about a sea change. It is not something that can change a situation. He felt that poetry is meant for something more ephemeral. Ephemeral means something for a very short time, maybe one for a day or so, വളരെ കുറച്ച് നിമിഷത്തേക്ക് മാത്രം നിൽക്കുന്ന ഒരു സംഭവമായിട്ടാണ് പോയട്രീനെ കണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത് ഓഡൻ. Auden says that poetry is like water. It is something that flows on south. That's what it says. Flows on south. It enters into the ranches of isolation and busy griefs. It travels from place to place, soothing bits of the world. But it only soothes certain souls, not all. Soothe ചെയ്യാൻ മാത്രമേ പറ്റുന്നുള്ളൂ, ആശ്വസിപ്പിക്കാൻ കഴിയുന്നു. പക്ഷെ ഒരു ചേഞ്ച് വരുത്താൻ കഴിയുന്നില്ല പോയട്രിക്ക്. Poetry cannot bring about a change. It can bring consolation. ഒരു കൺസലേഷൻ കൊണ്ട് തരാനായിട്ട് പറ്റുന്നുണ്ട്, പക്ഷേ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് നോട്ട് ഏബിൾ ടു ബ്രിങ് എനി ചേഞ്ച്. യേറ്റ്സ് ഓൾവേസ് എക്സ്പെക്റ്റഡ് ദാറ്റ് ഹിസ് poems would change the way people think, and it would bring about a change in the way Irish people think. But Auden says that nothing of that sort had happened. Yeats' poem could not bring any change in Ireland, or could not bring any change in the way Irish people thought. Mad Ireland is still that mad Ireland even after his death. So the second stanza is very personal. The second section shows how deeply involved Yeats was in Irish independence movement of his time. Some of his most remembered poems, as I told you, Easter 1916, emerged from this engagement with struggle for independence. He cared passionately for Ireland, but his political position or his stand were often complicated. Yeats wrote poetry to cure his country. He thought he had changed and cured it, but his country is not cured. This country, or his country, is still sick, and Auden calls it a mad Ireland. Auden says that Ireland has not changed even a bit because of Yeats' poetry. ഒന്നും തന്നെ ഒരു വ്യത്യാസവും കൊണ്ടുവരാൻ പറ്റിയിട്ടില്ല എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. However, he isn't saying that poetry is worthless എന്നല്ല പറയുന്നത്. worthless ആണെന്നൊന്നും അല്ല പറയുന്നത്. After all, Auden himself is speaking to us through a poem itself, അല്ലേ? അപ്പോൾ ഒരു പോയത്തിൽ കൂടെ തന്നെയല്ലേ ഓഡൻ നമ്മളോട് സംസാരിക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ ഓഡൻ പോയത്തിനെ അങ്ങനെ വളരെ മോശമാക്കിയോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വേർത്ത്ലെസ് ആണ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ യൂസ്ലെസ് ആണെന്ന് പറയുന്നില്ല. ബിക്കോസ് ഓഡൻ ഹിംസെൽഫ് ഇസ് എ പോയറ്റ് ആൻഡ് ഹീ ഈസ് യൂസിങ് എ പോയം ടു സ്പീക്ക് ടു അസ്. What he says is poetry cannot or can't be, or it can't do specific things, but it can make us think about things. It cannot change things. It can make us think. Our perspectives നെ മാറ്റാൻ പറ്റും, നമ്മളുടെ ചിന്തകളെ മാറ്റാൻ പറ്റും, നമ്മളുടെ ആശയങ്ങളെ സ്വാധീനിക്കാൻ പറ്റുന്നതാണ്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സ്വാധീനിക്കാനുള്ള ഒരു കഴിവുള്ളതാണ് കവിതയ്ക്ക്. That's what our Auden tries to tell us. It cannot do anything specific. It cannot bring any change, but it can make us think about things differently. Think about things that we may not normally or ordinarily think about. This subtle distinction indicates the delicate opposition between Yeats and Auden. Yeats and Auden തമ്മിലുള്ള വ്യത്യാസമാണ് ഇവിടെ കാണുന്നത്. Yeats considered poetry to be a tool. യേറ്റ്സിൻ്റെ ഇതിൽ ഒരു ടൂളാണ്, ഒരു ചേഞ്ച് വരുത്താൻ പറ്റുന്ന, അതായത് ലോകത്തെ മാറ്റിമറിക്കാൻ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ലോകത്തിനെ സ്വാധീനിക്കാൻ പറ്റുന്നതും അതേപോലെ തന്നെ മാറ്റം കൊണ്ടുവരാൻ പറ്റുന്ന ഒരു ടൂളായിട്ടാണ് യേറ്റ്സ് പോയട്രീനെ കൺസിഡർ ചെയ്യുന്നത്. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ യേറ്റ്സ് കൺസിഡർ പോയട്രി ആസ് എ ടൂൾ ദാറ്റ് ക്യാൻ ബ്രിങ് ചേഞ്ച് ടു ദ വേൾഡ്. Whereas Auden, on the other hand, Auden believes that it is nothing in itself. ഒറ്റയ്ക്ക് കവിത ഒന്നുമല്ല, കവിതയ്ക്ക് ഒറ്റയ്ക്ക് ഒന്നും ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റില്ല. Its value lies in how its readers respond to it. ഒരു കവിത നമ്മൾ ആസ്വദിക്കുന്നത് എങ്ങനെയാണോ, വായനക്കാർ ആസ്വദിക്കുന്നത് എങ്ങനെയാണോ, അതിനെ ഇൻ്റർപ്രറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതും അതിനെ മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നതും എങ്ങനെയാണോ, അതിനെ ബേസ് ചെയ്തിരിക്കും the power of poetry. So that's what Auden tries to say. Auden tries to tell us that it can change the way we think. It may not be able to specifically do a particular thing. Yeats, on the other hand, believed that it is a powerful tool that can change the way or change the world as such. That's the difference between Auden and Yeats. Yeats' fault was that he expected too much out of his poetry. Auden clarifies that poetry is not a force in itself, but made dynamic by its interpreters, we readers. It is we readers who give it meaning. We being Indians, how we interpret his poetry, how each reader of us, നമ്മൾ ഇന്ത്യക്കാരാണ്, അതും സൗത്ത് ഇന്ത്യൻസ് ആണ്, നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെയാണ് യേറ്റ്സിൻ്റെ ഓരോ പോയം നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ആസ്വദിക്കുന്നത്, നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഇൻ്റർപ്രറ്റ് ചെയ്തെടുക്കുന്നത്, നമ്മളുടെ കൾച്ചറിലൂടെ അതെങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മൾ അതിൻ്റെ അർത്ഥം മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നത്, അങ്ങനെ അതിന് ഒരുപാട് വേരിയേഷൻസ് ആണ്, ഒരുപാട് വ്യത്യാസമാണ്. ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് ടോട്ടലി ഡിഫറെൻറ്റ് ഫ്രം ഹൗ എ പേഴ്സൺ ഫ്രം ദി യൂറോപ്യൻ കൺട്രി വുഡ് വ്യൂ ഇറ്റ്. Okay, it is totally different from how a person from the African continent would view it. It is totally different from how you and I view it. So everyone, it depends on how we interpret poems. So poetry represents or presents a world that's both real and far removed from the real world. When you're done reading a poem, you don't have anything tangible to keep from the experience. Poetry is a way of happening. Auden seems to insist on the mobility and vitality of poetry. Amidst all the freezing isolation of the world, poetry is an active instrument. That's what he says. Okay. Now we'll move on to the section 3. So section 2 was very personal. It was all about Yeats, his idea of poetry, his involvement in the Irish nationalism, his criticisms, his involvement with several or aristocratic women, and so many personal matters. And also you will find the difference between Auden and Yeats and how they view poetry. So it's all very personal in the second section. The third section. Now let's move on to the third section of the poem. In the third section of the poem, for the first time, Yeats is referred to by name. Till now, in the first section, you will find that he was referred to as he. In the second section, it becomes more personal, you and your. In the third section, Yeats is called by his name for the first time in the poem. That is. ഇതൊരു എലിജിയുടെ ഒരു കോൺസെപ്റ്റാണ്, എലിജിയിലുള്ള ഒരു സ്ട്രക്ചറാണ്. പക്ഷേ എലിജിയിൽ എങ്ങനെയാണെന്ന് വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ, കൺവെൻഷണൽ എലിജിയിൽ എങ്ങനെയാണെന്ന് വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ അത് ആദ്യം തന്നെ പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. ഇൻ ദ ബിഗിനിങ് ഇറ്റ് സെൽഫ് ഇറ്റ് എക്സ്പ്ലെയിൻസ് റൈറ്റ് അറ്റ് ദ ബിഗിനിങ് ജസ്റ്റ് ഹൂ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് ദാറ്റ് ദ പോയറ്റ് ഈസ് മോർണിംഗ് ഹിയർ. ആരെ പറ്റി ഓർത്തിട്ടാണ് പോയറ്റ് ദുഃഖിക്കുന്നത്, ആരുടെ മരണമാണ് ഇവിടെ ഓർക്കുന്നത്, ആ ഗ്രീഫ് ആരെ പറ്റിയിട്ടാണ് മോൺ ചെയ്യുന്നത് എന്നുള്ളതെല്ലാം ആദ്യത്തെ ഭാഗത്തിൽ തന്നെ പറയാറുണ്ട്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പറഞ്ഞു പോകുന്നുണ്ട്. എലിജിയിൽ, കൺവെൻഷണൽ എലിജിയിൽ. പക്ഷേ ഇവിടെ Auden is reversing this practice. I told you right from the beginning. Auden reverses so many practices of elegy. കൺവെൻഷണൽ സ്റ്റൈലൊക്കെ ഒരുപാട് മാറ്റങ്ങൾ വരുത്തുന്നുണ്ട്. പാസ്റ്റോറൽ എലിജിയിൽ നിന്നുമൊക്കെ ഒരുപാട് വ്യത്യാസം കൊണ്ടുവരുന്നുണ്ട്. പാസ്റ്റോറൽ എലിജിയിൽ നേച്ചർ ഇസ് മോർണിംഗ്, നേച്ചർ സ്റ്റോപ്സ്, ബട്ട് ഇൻ Auden says that nature is not stopping anything. Nature's course, it continues, life continues. Whoever dies, life just continues. It is a poetry that will survive. The person will die. Whereas in a conventional elegy, the whole nature stands still and mourns the death of the poet. Okay, so from the beginning itself, you see that Auden is reversing the practice. Here also, Auden reverses the practice of putting it in the beginning, he puts it at the end. Instead of putting it at the beginning, he puts it at the end. Final sectionലാണ് യേറ്റ്സിൻ്റെ പേര് പറയുന്നത്. Okay? Yeats is referred to as the Irish vessel. Earth, receive an honoured guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. എന്നാ പറയുന്നത്. So Yeats is referred to as Irish vessel here. A body meant to carry only poetry, not the problems of the speaker, which is found in the second section, which was personal, and all the problems he faced, that was addressed in the second section. So here it is, he's an Irish vessel. Irish vessel, here is the sense that he was an Irish poet, and only his poetry, his body is meant to carry only the poetry that he has written. Auden also gives us some of the specifics of Yeats' death, particularly the time of his death. Yeats died in 1939, just as the world was gearing up for the Second World War. Yeats and Auden, both, I told you from the beginning, it's of the World War that shattered the whole world, the two world wars. Yeats and Auden shared the sentiments of many of their fellow artists and intellectuals who were dismayed at the thought of another world war. The speaker paints the impending war as a sort of nightmarish unreality. So the third stanza of the section doesn't seem to have anything to do with Yeats, the man. Auden perhaps believes that a good way to pay homage to someone is to spend some time thinking about his views and concerns. He goes on to admire how Yeats combines realism with rejoicing. The poet is a figure that lives in through Yeats' poetry and isn't really attached to Yeats, the man. Poetry is now channelized into a single image of a healing fountain. The poem holds out hope for the whole world. Okay, so here the poem concludes the third section, or the third section of the poem concludes with an impressive summing up of Yeats' achievement. It is a funeral ആണ്. And Yeats, the poet, is laid to rest. Auden is praying to the earth, ഭൂമി ദേവിയോട് പ്രാർത്ഥിക്കുകയാണ്, to receive the mortal remains of W.B. Yeats. There is a biblical saying also, thou art dust, to dust thou returnest. Thus the dust that was Yeats shall return to dust, and in his death Ireland has lost its great poet. Ireland is now emptied of its poetry. This is a great tribute to the poet of Irish nationalism and Irish literary renaissance. Here, by Irish vessel, Auden means Yeats' body as a vessel, an instrument, or as a thing that is meant as a vessel, that is meant to carry only poetry and not the personal problems of the poet, as mentioned in section 2. So all of them, now the poet invokes, third sectionil കൂടുതലും വേൾഡ് വാറിൻ്റെ ആ ഒരു ഇതാണ് കൊണ്ടുവരുന്നത്. വേൾഡ് വാറിൻ്റെ ആ യൂറോപ്പ് ഇൻ ദി ഗ്രിപ്പ് ഓഫ് വേൾഡ് വാർ. So the poet Auden is asking Yeats to become a beacon in the encircling gloom of Europe, to penetrate into the depth of darkness, and with the planting of his verse, his poems, transmute the curse of fallen humanity and make us rejoice in the vineyard of human liberty. So there is also a biblical രീതിയിലാണ് ഇത് കൊണ്ടുപോകുന്നത്. Fall of Adam and Eve, the curse of the fallen man. And here, ഇവിടെ Yeats's poem, let the Yeats poem be like the songs of David and songs of Solomon. Let it bring soothing, let it soothe the soul. Let his poetry enlarge our sensibility, enable us to live better lives. Thus, the he concludes a poem just like in a true conventional elegy. അതൊരു ശരിക്കുള്ള ട്രഡീഷണൽ എലിജിയിലുള്ള പോലത്തെ കൺക്ലൂഷനാണ്. ഇറ്റ് എൻഡ്സ് ഓൺ എ നോട്ട് ഓഫ് റിലീഫ്, എ നോട്ട് ഓഫ് ഹോപ്പ്. ഐ ടോൾഡ് യു ദാറ്റ്, നോ? ആൻഡ് ദ പോയറ്റ് feels that Yeats's life has not been lived in vain. വെറുതെ ഒരു ജീവിതം ആള് ഇറ്റ് വാസ് നോട്ട് ഔട്ട്, ഹി ലിവ്ഡ്, അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ജീവിതം പാഴായി പോയിട്ടില്ല. He lived a life. There was, of course, in the second section he says poetry has not changed Ireland എന്ന് പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. പക്ഷേ ലാസ്റ്റിൽ പറയുന്നുണ്ട് വെറുതെ ആയില്ല അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ജീവിതം. ഇറ്റ് വാസ് നോട്ട് യൂസ്ലെസ്. His poetry, of course, is powerful in the world of spirit. So there's a difference there. The difference, Auden does not say that poetry is worthless. Auden only says that what Yeats believed that poetry can change the world. Auden just corrects it and says that it cannot change the world. It can change the perspectives of the people, the readers. It can touch the spirit or the soul, and only those who are willing to accept it. So likewise, in the third section, final conclusion of the elegy, കൺവെൻഷണൽ എലിജിയിലുള്ള പോലെ തന്നെ ഹോപ്പിലൂടെയാണ് അവസാനിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. ഫസ്റ്റ് സെക്ഷനിൽ എന്താണ്? തീരാത്ത ഗ്രീഫാണ്. സെക്കൻഡ് സെക്ഷനിൽ ഗ്രീഫ് ഉണ്ടെങ്കിലും ആക്സെപ്റ്റൻസ് ഓഫ് ഡെത്താണ്. ഡെത്തിനെ ആക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു, ഇന്നെവിറ്റബിൾ ആണ്, അത് ആക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. പക്ഷേ എങ്കിൽ കൂടിയും അത് ജീവിച്ച് പോകുന്നുണ്ട്. ഒരു ഇറ്റേണിറ്റി, ഇമ്മോർട്ടാലിറ്റി ഉണ്ട്. ജീവിതം, സോൾ ഹാസ് ആൻ ഇമ്മോർട്ടാലിറ്റി എന്നുള്ള ആ വിശ്വാസം, ഇന്നെവിറ്റബിലിറ്റി ഓഫ് ഡെത്ത് ആൻഡ് ആക്സെപ്റ്റൻസ് ഓഫ് ഡെത്ത് ആണ് സെക്കൻഡ് സെക്ഷൻ. And in the final section, it ends with a note of hope. That is, the world can hope that things will be better. Okay? It is not useless. His poems were all rich. And it was powerful. So Auden's conclusion is that there's a rich tribute to the achievement of poetry, that in the world of spirit, poetry can do almost everything. Now I'll just tell you what this section means. Our final section, Europe in the section on us. Europe in the grip of World War on. അതാണ് ഇതിനകത്ത് പറഞ്ഞു പോകുന്നത്. ഇൻ ദ നൈറ്റ് മെയർ ഓഫ് ദ ഡാർക്ക്. അപ്പോൾ എംറ്റീഡ് ഓഫ് ഇറ്റ്സ് പോയട്രി കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് കുറച്ച് സെക്ഷൻ ഉണ്ട്, അതാണ് ഇവിടുന്ന് എടുത്ത് കളഞ്ഞിരിക്കുന്നത്. പിന്നെ തുടങ്ങുന്നതാണ് ഇൻ ദ നൈറ്റ് മെയർ ഓഫ് ദ ഡാർക്ക് ഓൾ ദ ഡോഗ്സ് ഓഫ് യൂറോപ്പ് ബാർക്ക്. In the nightmare of the dark, here is a reference to the terrible years before the outbreak of the World War II. That is in 1939, the year of Yeats's death. The dogs of Europe bark is a reference to the selfish, bloodthirsty leaders of Europe like Hitler and Mussolini. Each nation lived in separation, isolation, and they became their own enemies. They hated each other. They were full of hatred and selfishness. As of the intellectual disgrace. Now what do you mean by intellectual disgrace? Intellectual disgrace is the intellectual and political condition of Europe during the 30s. The atmosphere was rife with suspicion, mutual jealousy, hatred and alarm. And these lines evoke powerfully the crisis in Europe preceding the Second World War. Europe was in the darkest period of its history and the life was nightmarish. Each nation was sequestered. Sequestered means separated. They were separated in hate from each other. There was no unifying force against this disintegration. And even the intellectual leaders, philosophical leaders in Vareem, they could do nothing to save, because even they were biased, prejudiced. Even they yielded to political pressure. They also yielded to political persuasion, and the spirit of individual liberty was betrayed. Nobody cared for individual liberty, not even the intellectual leaders. No one had any compassion for humanity. So it was a total intellectual disgrace. Even philosophy failed. Normally philosophy, poetry, all these things are the ones that bring solace to the world. But that also failed because nobody cared for one another. No one cared. Even the intellectual leaders could do nothing to save. Okay. Now what does the word locked and frozen mean? Locked and frozen means pity could find no expression. It was frozen. സഹതാപം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന വാക്ക് അവിടെ ഇല്ല. ആർക്കും അങ്ങോട്ടും ഇങ്ങോട്ടും ആരേനെയും they could not stand each other. They were all selfish. There are so many poems. You have No Men Are Foreign by James Kirkup. You have Death Fugue. All these poems are very powerful. They bring powerful images of what was the horrors that was happening. Jews in against Hitler ചെയ്തിരുന്നത് എല്ലാം ഇൻഹ്യൂമൻ ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ടൈമായിരുന്നു വേൾഡ് വാറിൻ്റെ ടൈം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. Okay, so what does unconstraining voice mean? Unconstraining voice means liberating voice. Liberating voice which can persuade us to rejoice. Such is the power of poetry. So Auden says that Yeats' poetry is like a powerful ray. It can penetrate through the darkness. It is an unconstraining voice, a liberating voice. അപ്പോൾ ഈ ഡാർക്ക് ആയിട്ടുള്ളൊരു പീരീഡിൽ, ഇത്രയും ഡാർക്കായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു എക്സ്ട്രീം ഈവിൾ ആയിട്ടുള്ളൊരു പീരീഡിൽ, what comes as a solace, as a rejoice, as a hope, or Yeats's poetry comes as a solace, as a hope. Okay, and if you look at the words like farming and vineyard, they're all biblical. They evoke an image of fallen Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, what all is happening, the curse of man, the decay of man, one man hating another. So all this evokes, the poem sums up with Auden hoping that Yeats's poetry may enlarge our sensibility and enable us to live as sensitive human beings. ഇത്രയും മോശപ്പെട്ട ഒരു സമയത്ത് യേറ്റ്സിൻ്റെ പോയം ഒരു സൊളേസ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഹോപ്പ് ആയിട്ട്, ബീക്കൺ ഓഫ് ഹോപ്പ്, it will stand as a beacon of hope. That's what he says. Follow poet, follow right to the bottom of the night with your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. So even during this terrible times, your unconstraining voice, your liberating voice gives us a time to hope that there will be a better time. With the farming of make a vineyard of the curse, അതായത് ഇത്രയും ട്രാജിക് ആയിട്ടുള്ള സമയത്തും അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പോയം കവിത വായിക്കുമ്പോൾ there is hope even in the terrible of times. Okay, sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress, in the deserts of the heart. Let the healing fountain start in the prison of his days. Teach the free man how to praise. So the healing fountain is a spring of poetry. So Auden says that by writing a poem, Yeats can transform the curse of humanity. That is, now whatever is happening is curse of humanity. The fall of Adam, the fall of man, man hating one another, the trick of Satan, man killing one another, all these frustrations and failures. Yeats speaks of all these. He sings the songs of man's failures and frustration. He says that he's able to create hope even in the midst of tragedy. He creates a place for hope or prayer, and he feels that by reading Yeats's poem, one will be able to live as a sensitive human being. So that's the end of the poem. We have completed all the 3 sections. Okay, so just read through the 3rd section, Earth receive an honored guest. From that section onwards, you will find whatever the summing up as in a conventional elegy. But again, it is a reversal, because normally in a conventional elegy, the poet whom is being mourned, the person who is being mourned is normally spoken at the beginning. But here, Auden reverses that and he puts it into the concluding section. And also, in the rest of it, that is in the Nightmare of the Dark, from all that, earlier it was indirect, but now it is more direct. Directly, he speaks about Europe in the grip of world wars, where world is like in the grip of terror, in the grip of nightmare, and also the fall of man, the curse of man. And he says that Yeats's poem is like a hope to the fallen mankind. There will be a prayer. It then concludes that people will be able to live more as a sensitive human being. There is hope for the world. Things will change for the better. So that's about it. I hope you have understood. If you have any doubts, please let me know when we take up our interaction in our class.